book is the single if you have anybody that's interested in politics or interested in liberty or freedom, this is the book you give them. This is the book. And this is the book that I read, quote unquote, listened to, that completely changed the way I feel and think about things. Or it also, the things that I've thought already, it kind of put it in, I guess, word form.
I would venture to say that the thesis of the book is that everything that we're witnessing happening right now in the world of politics is rooted in centralized power. All right, so what you have is you have a group of people that are looking to pretty much parasite themselves off of their neighbors, and they centralize some power and they give themselves legitimacy, and then they steal from their neighbors. It's essentially what it is. They talk about how you can do it state to state, you can do it from state to person, and they basically are a parasitic body. Here's where this book comes into play, because this is where, if you are on the right and you're going to read this book, when you get into the second chapter, it's going to talk about the replacement of the divine state with not the individual leading the state as being the divinity, but as the Constitution being the divinity, and that people are worshiping the Constitution, whereas they would normally have worshipped a head of state that was deeming themselves as divine. And that's where the parallels start to come into play. So when you look in the second chapter and they talk about, he goes, in the present more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by an invocation of a new God. And this is where it really comes into today, science. While reason is invoked more than the previous centuries, this is not the true reason of the individual and his exercise of free will. It is still collectivists and determinists.
So skipping talking about the Constitution and bringing up the fact that, like, the state basically nominates its own people to navigate through the documents, in which case you would just kind of get them there and then be like, so like with the Constitution, and then you can kind of bring it in that way.
So I've actually had this conversation recently with somebody, and I was like, I don't know how, because they're waiting for like different gun laws to pass here in New Jersey, and they're saying, I can't wait for it to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. And I say, well, that's funny, because the Supreme Court of the United States is not an elected position. It's appointed by the state. So you have the state running the state with the state.
So that's one of the biggest things that I took. So I took like three big things, right? That's number one that I took from this book, all right? It was basically that the judiciary provides cover for the excesses and the overreach of the state, right? So, Mike, you started talking about basically, where authority is derived from. Right? Like, how do we look at someone who's the president or the Senate or something, or back in the day when we looked at the monarch and we were like, well, why do we even follow, King George? Why do we listen to him? Well, in the past, it was like, well, God deemed him the ruler. So what King George says goes, right? Now we have a system of 535 people, and the government needs some authority for us to be like, all right, when they speak, we listen, right? Well, the backing of that, the excuse my language, but the bullshit backing of that is the Supreme Court, and the thought that, the Supreme Court's going to protect us, right? It's always going to be there as the Alamo. Yes, right? But the problem is, what we found is, more often than not, the Supreme Court actually ends up reinforcing
how the state preserves itself. It is I think it's in chapter 3, and it talks about how, like, tradition is and the idea of, like, and history is like a strong way of preserving the state, because you idolize your ancestors naturally. Correct. And when you idolize your ancestors, you're also idolizing their leaders and their kings. Correct. So it keeps that oppression intergenerational. And then, it's tradition, and nationalism is another one.
If the tyranny is imposed, anybody who speaks out against it is now going to be cast as a conspiracy theorist, because all of a sudden they're the ones who aren't idolizing and worshiping at those that came before them, and not accepting narrative from those that were supposed to be worshiping.
100%.
So even if it is 100% legitimate, and the state has worked with its partners in science and worked with its partners in media, it creates this false sense of confidence in what the message they're portraying, and anybody who has any kind of opposite thought is a conspiracy theorist, no matter what.
I think Rothbard also points out something where the state doubles down on preserving itself. You just have to look at the penalties for someone who goes against the state versus someone who creates an infraction against a regular human being in the country.
Here's your pop reference.
Yeah.
The Capitol.
don't care about anything but themselves and preserving themselves. And then it goes to Rothbard when you look at it and you go into what the state fears. And they fear their loss of legitimacy. They fear the individual understanding and realizing that, hey, I don't really need them. Like, what are they really doing for me and not for themselves? And that's why they constantly work with all the partners that they work with to flex on people.
So this goes to my number 2 takeaway from the book, okay? The idea of war and conflict, okay?
That's what state fears. Yeah.
And they're afraid of war and conflict taking their power. They have to convince you that it's you that are in danger. Right. But you aren't. It's them, right? It's the people in power that are in danger. It's the reason why they institute a draft, right? Back in the day of feudal lords, like the movie Braveheart, right? All those dudes are standing around with a bunch of lords going, why the hell are we here fighting for these assholes' land?
It used to be a war between rulers, which he says.
Exactly. Yeah. So when war or conflict breaks out, they have to convince you that we're all in this together.
It's also the other way too. Like, if you're not in danger, then you're being selfish. Like, it's one or the other. Like, you either are in grave peril and you need to rely on us, or if you want to go against us, you're just completely against the we that doesn't exist, apparently.
State is the embodiment of politics, right? Yes. It's political parasite. It's a political parasite. What does he say?
And remember that he says, people think that like the state creates things, and Rothbard specifically says it's always an antecedent to a free market, right? It always comes after.
It always comes after because
it's parasitic.
It notices the accumulation of wealth and property amongst the people that they're doing it freely, which is what he calls a social power versus
like authoritarian or state.
What did he say? It's a social power versus I forget what or state power versus state power.
Yes.
Right. And the social power is when you have all of a sudden people come together and it becomes wealth and people are doing well, and all of a sudden the state comes in and says, "Hey, we need some of that."
Right.
We're talking about terrorists and everything, right? War is the ultimate in the state's power.
Yes.
When the state is in a state of war, okay, they have ultimate power. And he says, in war, state power is pushed to its ultimate. And under the slogan of defense and emergency, it can impose a tyranny upon the public, such as it might openly be resisted in a time of peace.
Yep.
Right? So things that they will do that you would lose your mind over in a time of peace, which don't be so silly and political comes into play.
Yep.
All of a sudden, if they stir up enough fear and tell you, hey, we got to go to war, now all of a sudden it's okay.
I was going to bring up in the section of how the state preserves itself, where I actually wrote in the margins here, COVID, new normal, because it says, listen only to your brothers or adjust to society, thus becomes ideological weapons for crushing individual dissent.
So the third biggest thing that I took out of this book is, so we've talked a lot about kind of like how the state is constructed, how it controls things, how it preserves itself, right? The third biggest thing I took out of it was, all right, where does the buck stop, right? Like, if we are subservient to the state, okay, then what is the state subservient to? Well, you actually have a situation where libertarians always get told, like, well, libertarianness won't exist anywhere. It exists internationally. The countries themselves legit work with each other with no supreme power. Now, you could make the argument that America is kind of the ringleader because of how much we spend on defense and things like that. But still, the other countries could band together in order to fight back if they wanted, right? So there is a level of free market when it comes to the states themselves having to negotiate. But they don't give us that freedom. Right? Like, they only give that freedom to themselves, and that's the only time that they're kind of on an even playing ground.
So let's talk about that for a second. So let's tie in Feed Philly to what the government has done. So the government,
nice.
The government has turned around and created a system in which they are the ultimate arbiter of what is good and what is evil. So the way that Rothbard portrays this creation of the cathedral, we'll call it, right, for all intents and purposes, because I'm not reading the book and I've lost the words at this point. they deitize, is that the word?
Deify.
They deify. They
Yeah.
deify themselves to the point where they are the arbiters of truth, and they are speaking the truth. So when they turn around and tell you
so
that
many sex
we
jokes right
will
now.
take care of the homeless. We will take care of the homeless. We will ensure that everybody is handled. It removes the natural incentive for those in the community to step up and take care of the homeless themselves.
Yep.
So then it puts an exorbitant amount of homeless people on the street because every time they centralize something, it never works. It's inefficient. There's too much bureaucracy because every dollar that goes to DC or to whatever central power is running it gets filtered through layers of bureaucracy and into their pockets first.
Yep.
So every dollar you give them, maybe only 30 cents is going to the actual people that need it. So then we need somebody like Frankie and her Feed Philly organization to step up to fill the void. The point
Good
that
point,
Rothbard
Cheeto.
makes. That's exactly what it is. They utilize all of the tools of thousands of years of human governance and create themselves as the deity, not for any other religion other than the religion of the state. Which is why the term.
Is it also
Exactly.
is it also cover for their sins? Right, like is
Wow, it's
it
an act
is
of contrition.
Is it their
We just got
alignment?
deep, bro.
Right, is it their alignment with the holy to be like, see, I'm so holy, I would never do something sinful. So if I did something,
Kamala would never do something sinful.
I was
Exactly.
actually-
She
I
would
was
never
gonna- no, I
hold
was gonna say
prisoners
something-
beyond their sentence term for cheap slave labor.
And
She would
Jason,
never
Jason
do it.
brought that up. He
But
said
that's-
Kamala
but
Harris
that's
started saying
also
she's
in
a woman
the-
of faith.
That's also in the book though too, where they talk about if the state commits what would be a crime individual against individual, it's to be expected because it's for your own good.
right?
We're doing
It's
it
for your own good.
you.
It's for your own
we
good.
have to protect you from yourself.
Oh, and he goes into that when he talks about war as well. He talks about when the state goes to war against other aggressors,
yeah,
it's
I'm
to
not
defend.
ready to bring that up.
It's to defend yourselves.
That was the very first chapter.
It's to defend yourselves. You need to defend yourselves. But when you turn around, there is no defense of yourself when the state itself starts to enact those tyrannies upon you. Right. It's then frowned upon that you are defending yourself.
Even from other people.
You're
but they-
therefore committing suicide
But
if
they,
you.
but they
Right,
so
'cause
much
you are the
need you to
government to
defend
them.
yourself against other states to the point where they will conscript you and force you to do so. However, God forbid they enact tyranny on you. You're not allowed to defend yourself. This is for your own good. Right? He talks about how the Constitution.
That was the name of my weatherman.
So he goes into the Constitution, how the Constitution was supposed to protect all of our rights against an overpowered state. Then he talks about how the judiciary is set up to change language and to create things so that it defends and helps. It actually helps grow the state. Okay. Then he talks about how Calhoun had the idea that what we need to do is have a minority protection by allowing the states to nullify everything that happens against. Right, you nullify what when the state comes together and says, "Hey, the federal government is wrong." That's not going to happen in our state. But then he goes into the argument of, "All right, but what if that specific state is oppressing the people, and the federal government doesn't have power to stop that?" So then he goes, "Would it be up to the counties or the cities or the wards or the boroughs to be able to step up and nullify that?" But what if the county or the city or the ward is doing it and there's nobody to stop them? When the only logical ultimate route is the individual needs to be able to stand up and nullify an oppressive law without risk of penalty.
All right, so let's bring this around the home stretch. Any last thoughts about Rothbard that we haven't covered?
I talked about this a little bit before. If you have any interest in liberty or freedom, you read this book. This is the #1 book you should read. Absolutely. It is short. It is to the point. It covers different aspects. This is the book you read, period. It is the best book for any budding libertarian or somebody.